Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Here's your favorite program, Early Exchange, where we shape policy and advance development. We started the conversation looking at the plight of startups in Lagos, which is believed to be the largest hub for startups in Africa. And now to our second big story, which is to look at the implication of the global inflation on the global economy. You're aware that in the last 3 years, global economy has been battling with inflation surge, which has largely impacted some nations more than the other. While some are slowly recovering from this impact, some are still battling with this impact. But we want to look at the lessons for monetary authorities when it comes to authorities in charge of managing the economy or deploying the right tools in order to be able to create a buffer for the impact of inflation. And by extension, we'll be looking at the role of central banks and other agencies that should be in position to manage inflation globally. Joining us for this conversation, we have Dr. Osaze Iyoha, who joins us from Canada. He's an economist analyst. Dr. Osaze, glad you have joined us on the election this morning.
Good morning, Nigerians. Good morning, studio.
All right. We often say the conversation is getting bigger, and having another guest, which is we are being joined by Segun Sopitan, who is a principal partner, Woodbridge and Scott Consulting. Segun, glad you have joined us this morning as well.
Good morning, Femi. Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here.
All right, gentlemen, glad to have you. It's the duo of Dr. Osaze and Segun join us for this conversation, so which makes it more engaging. I'm going to start with Segun. I'm going to start with you based on the fact that you've been following the trends globally as regards inflation surge. You're aware of the disruption this has brought to the global economy. But let's start by you walking us through how did we get to this level where nations for the past 3 years are battling with surging inflation, and what has that left the global economy and the impact on developing economies or developed economies or emerging economies globally? Give us a picture of how did we get to this level.
Okay, thanks for having me again. I think the facts are pretty clear. The events of the last 3, going on to 4 years actually now, when 2004, have been quite instructive and in some ways unprecedented. I think it's the first time in human history that the entire globe for a sustained period of more than a couple of weeks was shut down. The entire globe, all planes were down, all ships were down, all cars were down during the pandemic. And what that did was basically all economies shut down. And that's the trigger event that led to where the things that we've experienced over the last 3 years and to where we are now and to where we're likely to go. The aftershocks of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is still reverberating and is still affecting policy making, it's still affecting trends and events, and all of that. And then the second thing that's happened in that time has also been the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, as some would call it. That also created disruptions in critical parts of the global supply chain, such that, again, economies around the world were affected, and policymakers had to respond. And I think more recently, what's happening in the Middle East might again have some sort of an impact on overall turn of events globally. Even though I think with the recent killing of SOUQ, the leader of the Palestinian, I don't want to use the word terrorist because it's a sensitive political issue. Maybe that issue may help abate what's been building in that region. So if you take these 3 events, the biggest, of course, being COVID, you would see that it's quite remarkable that in fact we have been, as humanity and the globe, the world economy has been able to recover with some speed, more than what people expected. When COVID-19 hit and global economies went into recession, all of the major developing economies, all of the developed economies, the emerging economies, and the not so developed ones, everybody went into recession. The thought then was, were we going to have a V-shaped graph curve, or were we going to have a U shape, or were we going to have a W? And it's turned out in the largest part to have been a V shape, where we crashed into a very deep recession all over the world, and then we recovered very quickly as well. But then that recovery triggered inflationary pressures across the world that has seen us have inflation trending at historic figures. In some countries, highest figures in 40 years, in some 50 years, So here we are. The policymakers have been grappling with this, trying to, first of all, restart the economy to get growth back. And then having achieved that, trying to control the resultant inflation, So it's been a bit of a conundrum, but I think that all in all, given where we are today globally, I think the world economies have done well, and there are lots of lessons that have been learned, things that we can do better, things that we can do differently going into the future, But I think we're in a good place as we speak now.
All right, let me get to Dr. Osaze. How will you react to the inflation surge that's also affected the global economy, your own estimation? Then I would like you to give us a picture of what played out in Canada. You are in Canada. I'm sure, of course, it's a reality that Canada too has its own share of the surge. So what played out in Canada as regards the inflationary surge? And then what's your reaction to the impact or the destruction on the global economy?
Yeah, just collaborating the points that my co-analyst made, which is completely very true. It's the global inflation has been a combination of COVID-19. It hits the world in a way that has never been envisaged. I think in the history of the globe, of the world, I don't think there has been any time that we had such massive close down of factories. It's the easiest way to bring it to context is the fact that when you think of industrialized countries like China, Japan, it was, let's put it this way. I remember in 2021, around August, it was reported that vessels were roaming the sea with vessels literally hawking crude oil. In fact, at a point in March 2020, it was reported that crude oil was selling at $0. So you can imagine how terrible that was. So it just meant that all factories were closed. There was nobody who was buying oil. I think it now managed to come to around $10 around April, May 2020. So that just brings to context how factories, individuals, there was a complete shutdown of global economy. So it led to, it kept people in their houses. So the initial prediction by economists was that, demand and supply will balance themselves out when COVID eventually subsides. So when there's an opening in the economy, that people are coming out with reduced purchasing power. Companies, factories will also be coming out with low stock. So they'll be selling the old stock they have. The citizens or the human beings who are going to demand these goods are going to be coming out with low purchasing power. So they will both balance themselves and will not have that inflationary pressure. But it turned out it didn't turn out to be that way, because people came out with savings. Organizations started doing work from home. People started doing Zoom, online communication. So people's salary kept running, and so those predictions by economists did not work out. So it means that people came out with some pretty good purchasing power, but the supply end, the factories had been closed for months, so they now had to start kickstarting business. And the opening the lockdown was opened in phases. It was not a one-time opening, gradually. So it happened that supply could not match up with demand. And basic economics, when demand is higher than supply, you have shortage, then prices increase. So that was the beginning of the inflation. Supply took time to gradually start up, while people came out with full force. Some had not seen their relations for 5, 6 months. So with full force came out with their purchasing power, and supply couldn't meet it. Global price. We remember that US reported a 40-year high in inflation for the last 40 years. That was the highest. Even Canada reported about 11%. So almost all the global economies reported high inflation. So it was global. Then, as my co-analyst said, Russia-Ukraine war came. Ukraine it seemed like the hub of global food production of agric. It's reported that about 25% of the fertile land in the world, it's in Ukraine. Most of those Western markets, Ukraine services it. So the fact that there was war meant that people couldn't go to their farms. There was a time that the UN had to intervene so that Russia will allow old stock of food to just cross the ocean to the outside world. So it meant that Ukraine couldn't provide food for the world. Then Russia, that was the home of energy. In fact, is the leading supplier of energy to Europe. Also, Europe in a way of grandstanding, because Europe did not want to fund the war. The thinking was that if we keep buying oil from Russia, we are indirectly funding the war, that we don't want Russia to continue fighting. So they banned Russian energy, which boomeranged. That happened to be during the winter when they need heating for their homes and so on. So the fact that oil became expensive, Europe did not buy Russian oil, meant that oil was increasing. That led to increased prices because people had to buy expensive oil. Then the fact that Ukraine could not supply agriculture, so it was increasing prices from both ends. That done. Then that we're just recovering from COVID, the Russia-Ukraine war. So it was a combination of forces. Then to your second question, Canada, I think the previous program, I mentioned the fact that because these Western countries, these developed countries, have a systematic and well-developed monetary system. The monetary sector, the formal sector, is larger than the informal sector. In Canada, it's about 90-10. You can't see roadside shops. Yeah, you want to buy anything, you go to the big malls, the Walmarts, the Dollaramas, and so on. And these are all registered companies. So the government has been able to structure it. They've done their homework pretty well. So everything is formalized. So the formal sector of the economy is large. And monetary policy only penetrates or permeates through the formal sector. Monetary policy is useless where you have an informal sector. So CBN or the Bank of Canada kept increasing rates since 2022 for the last 2 years. So inflation rose to as high as 12-13%, but it's down to about 2.3% now. Why? Simply because of the textbook principle of fighting inflation. When there's inflation, increase interest rates so that it reduces purchasing power, it reduces demand and brings it to supply. So it has worked because the increase in interest rate, it meant that people couldn't borrow, people couldn't get enough money, producers couldn't get money to expand, which meant that they had to cut down jobs or reduce salaries, which meant that those who they reduced their salary, their purchasing power came down. So it now came to match supply. So that's it. So inflation ordinarily comes down. But in developing countries, as we've mentioned earlier, because the informal sector is larger than the formal sector, monetary sector policy has not been able to penetrate. So it's just simple. You see all the developed countries, UK reported over 11% to US, 10-11% to Canada. So there are countries in the West, Italy and so on, that also reported up to 20%, but they are all down now. They're on single digit figures. Why? Because their formal sector is large. Monetary sector only works in the formal sector. Yeah, because you increase interest rates, bankers would go to the bank and borrow. So when they go to the bank, they feel that increased rates. Unlike when they have nothing to do with the monetary, with the financial sector, the organized financial sector. So whatever the CBN or the central bank authorities in those different countries are doing will just not have any effect. So it's just the large formal sector, organized formal sector that's uh, redress the situation in Canada and other developed countries or economies.
Okay, so let me take the question to you first, Osaze.
Yeah.
Taking off from where you left off, looking at the measures that were explored by central banks of many countries to try to control inflation. One of them that was a general approach was trying to increase interest rates as a way to bring down inflation, when the results that was gotten in other countries was different from the results gotten by developing countries. If we're looking at the lessons that have been learned here, using monetary policies to try to control inflation, what would you say is one of the lessons that countries have learned, particularly developing countries like Nigeria? Because while other countries have increased rates and they've seen interest rate drop, talking about US, countries in Europe, but that of Nigeria has continued rising.
So I don't know if to say we have learned lessons, because you see, you can only talk you can only make such statements if you think that there has been a change. I still don't see a change, because we still have our central bank still increasing rates. Just for context, in 2022, before central bank started increasing rates, it was MPR was 11.5%. In 2022, MPR was 11.5%. Inflation was about 15.70%, March 2022 specifically. MPR 11.5%, inflation was 15.70%. Today, gradually, progressively, MPR has been increased from 11.5% in March 2022. Today, it's about 27.25%, thereabout. MPR today. Inflation rate has gone up to about 32%. So it means MPR increased, inflation rate kept increasing. So just until the last MPC meeting, CBN, everybody was expecting that CBN might reduce it. They increased it again. So I don't know if developing countries, specifically Nigeria, I don't know if to say we've learned our lessons. But if there were to be lessons learned, I think it's the fact that fiscal policy, we should have learned now that fiscal policy has to work in sync with monetary policy, because monetary policy does not work in an informal sector, a sector that is largely informal. I think in those sectors, fiscal policy has to take the lead. All monetary policy does is just to regulate the financial sector, the banking sector, because if you are increasing rates, the danger is this: you keep increasing rates in the financial sector, then you keep increasing rates in the financial sector. What happens is you're also affecting economic growth. You get it? Economic growth is suffering. CRR, what do you call it? Credit, cash reserves ratio of banks that are to be kept with the CBN has been increased. The last MPC, it was increased to 50%. You see, what it does is that you're mopping out liquidity from the economy. The businesses that are supposed to generate, that are supposed to kickstart the economy, because the whole problem is you're having a weak economy. The economy has gone down. All you need to do is regenerate the economy. Keynes said that after a recession or after a general downturn, he said just putting money into the economy. He said call some workers in the morning, dig a hole. In the afternoon, pay other workers, let them just cover the hole. The essence is bringing money into circulation. Yeah, so that is what CBN, most countries did at the beginning of the, just after COVID. But what we expect generally is that, let's just say, lessons that should have been learned is fiscal policy and monetary policy should learn now that they have to be in sync. There has to be fiscal responsibility. CBN or monetary authorities can do the best that they can, but until there is the structural aspect, because Nigeria's issue concerning inflation has been structural. The farmers' headers crisis was what led to CPI, because CPI has been what has been driving our inflation. So farmers' headers crisis drove CPI. You had issues with the ports authorities and so on. So those are fiscal policy issues. So CBN, I don't know if CBN has learned their lessons. Rather, I think they are even pushing the Nigerian economy deeper. Because imagine you are telling banks, CRR was increased to 50%, that's the cash reserve ratio. So what you are saying is that all banks should bring 50% of all their monies into the CBN. So how much do they have to give out to borrowers, to businessmen who want to borrow? You've put the asymmetric corridor at 500 plus 500 to minus 100%. You've put liquidity ratio at 30%. MPRO has been increased to about 27.25%. So all is aimed at dragging liquidity. These businessmen, importers who are supposed to inject into the economy, they don't have funds. So you are trying to tame inflation. Inflation is not being tamed, but you're hurting growth. So if we're even managing to tame inflation, then you say, okay, we are shortchanging one for the other, but we are not taming inflation. We are rather hurting goods, depriving producers of funds.
Just as I will come back to some of the measures that have been explored by the CBN and the result that they've yielded so far. But let's take it now to Segun Sopitan. If Dr. Osaze is saying that monetary policy should go side by side fiscal policy, and then the government is also experiencing revenue shortage, does that put the economy in a very in a predicament that is difficult to handle?
Well, yeah, but I would say that that predicament that you speak about is self-inflicted, and that's part of the concerns that some of us have. Like my colleague has said, we are approaching the question of inflation upside down. First of all, like you said, you don't lead with monetary policy, especially in a developing economy like Nigeria, bearing in mind the dislocations, the structural dislocations that we have, the infrastructure deficits that we have, the fact that structurally, supply chain, logistic chains are disrupted structurally, even without any of those shocks, those global shocks that we spoke about earlier, talking about COVID and all of that. Just by the way we are, and as a result of years of inefficient allocation of resources, which stems from corruption, we have not been able to build the fundamental structural foundations that drive growth and that will enable monetary policy and fiscal policy to affect outcomes, within the economy. So that's a problem. Now, to make matters worse, we have to remember, maybe talking about some of the lessons that ought to have been learned, because like my colleague said, I don't think any lessons have been learned. If we are to go by the posturing from the central bank in particular, and even from the rest of the government generally, lessons have not been learned. One of the other things that we continuously fail to take into account is the fact that there's a lopsided tilt of our economy when you look at the balance of trade and the consumption versus production conversation. The fact that our economy consumes largely things that are imported. Now, that in itself is not necessarily a problem if you are producing enough. But we're not producing enough, we're importing everything. And what that does is that it automatically places a demand pressure on your exchange rate. And because a large chunk of your economy is indexed to the exchange rate, because you import everything, as you do that, then inflation is further, fueled. Now, that part of the conversation, the central bank is not, in my opinion, doing enough. It looks as if how can we have increased MPR, the monetary policy rate, by over 850 basis points within a 1 year space? In fact, it's less than 1 year. Between February, I think it was when we had the first monetary policy committee meeting since the last one in July of last year, and the last one that held last month, 850 basis point increase has happened. It's unprecedented. And, you are basically stifling growth. And like Osaze said, we can tell from the results that it's not working. So how about us, take a different look at the entire economic management process and do things differently? Look, you spoke about government revenues. I don't think, relative to where we were a year ago, that government revenues are as bad as they used to be. Of course, it can be significantly better, but you see, with the removal of subsidies, first on foreign exchange, and as well as on petroleum products, and as well as on energy, you have freed up a significant chunk of revenues for governments. So the revenue challenges that we had a year ago are not as bad as they are today. But where is the commensurate impact on production, on infrastructure? It's been over a year, so that's enough time for the markets to see the impact of this additional revenues. It's signaling. There is also market sentiment when it comes to a lot of the factors that affect, outcomes within an economy. For example, in order for your currency to stabilize, you need foreign investment. You need investment capital flows into the country. Those flows will not happen if investors, global investors who have options, in front of them, they are taking decisions about where they will send their money based on the factors that they are seeing on ground in each of those destinations. So we are not signaling those investors adequately with regards to how serious we are about dealing with the challenges that exist in this economy that will provide the stability they would like to see to bring in long-term capital. So what you've seen so far in the last 6-7 months is the only kind of money that we've been getting is hot money. It's foreign portfolio investors who come into the market and just, they take advantage of the fact that your rates are high. They take the money, they make their quick, clean spread, they take it out. And that's why you saw the volatility that we're seeing in the foreign exchange market. So that's another area of the conversation that, unfortunately, it looks as if the policymakers are simply not focusing enough attention on. This preponderance or the fixation on talking about NPR, increasing NPR, increasing CRR, toying with all of those monetary policy instruments, it's not going to work because the problems that we have, the things that are driving our inflation are completely different from, what's happening in Canada, where my colleague is, or what's happening in the UK, or what's happening in the US. Those economies are well structured, they're grounded. Once you throw out a policy, the economy reacts, and you see that the lagging effect in those places is very, very short. 2 months, and you see a reaction. In Nigeria, you put an economic policy out there, and you may not even see in terms of the data, 3, 4, 5 months, sometimes 6 months before you begin to get that effect because of the dislocations. So I think that there's a lot to be said, there's a lot to be done from the policy-making point of view to provide some sort of coherence. The coherence is completely missing. So there's so much to be said about this conversation with regards to the lessons that we've learned, from what happened globally with inflation, how those economies have been able to tame inflation within very reasonable periods of time. This 10% double-digit inflation that we saw in most of these developed economies happened around towards the end of 2022 into early last year. But here we are today, they're all back within the thresholds that their central banks had fixed for themselves, using the instrumentality of monetary policy. Where are we? In that same period, whilst our people, locally were saying, hey, it's also happening in Canada, it's also happening in the US, there's inflation everywhere. Well, this is 2024, October, our inflation has started rising again. In fact, it never really stopped rising. There was just a momentary adjustment because of harvest, because of food inflation reducing a bit. So we really haven't seen a reduction or disinflation, if you like. So it's not working because our economy is different. Let's not forget about the percolation effect. Government revenues do not result in development because money just simply doesn't percolate. The way it works in other parts of the world is that when government spends money, it drives production, drives consumption, the entire economy responds. In Nigeria, the money hangs somewhere in the air. It doesn't get to the bottom. So, you don't get the expected economic benefits of that spending. So even when you talk about the revenues, what's the impact? I mean, just like I said earlier, we have had a double. Our government revenues in the last year has doubled. And in some cases, it's been more than 100% increase in revenues. Where is the result? In terms of even just forget about the infrastructure, just contracts, government spending that speculates down to contractors, who will then spend money, and until you get to, the bottom of the pyramid, we can't see it. So all of these things are not working because there's a large chunk of disconnect all over the place that is preventing, textbook approach from working in Nigeria.
A textbook approach. All right, that's quite interesting. Well, let's move on to something else. Let's look at the disruption that happened to the global supply chain as a result of the surge in inflation. I'm going to start with Segun because I want both of you to paint a picture of the two sides. Segun, you are in Nigeria and you've been following trends in Nigeria. So I'm going to start with you to give us the level of response to the disruption that happened to the global supply chain, how developing nations responded to this effect or this development, and the lessons for developing nations. Like you said, have we actually learned our lessons? Looking at the disruption that happened as a result of Russia-Ukraine war, you have the crisis in the Middle East, and interestingly, the war is not over yet. So have we learned our lesson? I want you to paint a picture of the level of response from the developing world or the developing economies, while Osaze will paint a picture of the developed economies, how they responded to the disruption in the global supply chain and the lessons for both sides. So I'm going to start with Segun.
I'm afraid I'm not sure that I can point specifically to one particular policy measure that you would say was a direct response to the logistic supply chain disruptions and how we've been able to reboot. Because what the rest of the world has done is they had to reboot, and they had to put policies in place that would make that reboot process as quick as possible. In Nigeria, we also suffered those same disruptions, things that would normally arrive, from around the world, whether it's food you're talking about or whether it's, other things that we're consuming or industrial parts, whatever. Things that would normally arrive, for example, in 6 weeks, were taking upward to 3 months, 4 months, as a result, first of all, of COVID, and also as a result of the war in Russia and Ukraine, which meant that some shipping channels had to be avoided. So ships were having to avoid certain parts of the ocean waterways in order to stay away from that disruption, with the war. What have we done about that in Nigeria, particularly, and maybe in the rest of the developing economies? I won't say that I've seen much by way of policy action to encourage logistic players within the logistic supply chain to revamp their activities very quickly. I think what we've simply done is that we've focused on the effect of the disruptions, and try to take the effect of the disruption away, whilst the disruption took care of itself. A lot of the supply chain is run by private businesses. It's in their enlightened self-interest to make sure that they get back on board and on track as quickly as possible. And I think that is exactly what happened. But in terms of policy, I can't put my mind to any specific action as we speak now. For example, you would think, oh, maybe at the ports, was there anything that was done to speed up, the clearing process, for example, to ensure that even though goods are delayed, then maybe they can get cleared much faster, just to ensure that the disruptions are reduced? No, if anything, it's worse now. And it's the same, if you talk about the airports or the seaports, it's basically the same thing. It's just business as usual. So I wouldn't say that I've seen any particular policy initiative that was like a response to the disruption and that tried to get us back on track as quickly as possible. I think we winged it and just gone with the flow and dealt with the aftershocks and the effects as much as we could, which we've not even done well, which is why we're still struggling economically as we speak.
Let me bring in Osaze here now. What's your input on the level of response to the disruption in the global supply chain when it comes to developed economies, and what are the lessons for them quickly?
Should I say here? Actually, I was in Nigeria all through the period of the COVID and post-COVID. I'm less than a year here, so I think I have more insight into how Nigeria responded. But in the developed world generally, it was simply, you know, it's called developed for a reason, because they are a producing economy, just like my co-analyst said. Nigeria, because we were lagging behind in most of the production indexes, the only way to get out of poverty, to get out of the development index on that development category is production. So simply because the developed countries were producing economies already, so all they needed to do was just open the factories, getting export their products out. So countries like Canada, so countries like UK, even if it's not an industrialized economy, it's a service economy. Countries like Canada, yeah, they've got oil. They're also a very business wholesale economy. Imagine an economy like in Canada. There's a mall called Walmart. Walmart recorded the highest revenue in the world in 2023 among all the companies. Volkswagen, BMW, just name all the companies that you know. Walmart recorded the highest revenue in the globe, 661 billion in 2023. It's very well grounded here in the country. So these businesses just took up, and the economy just had to respond. It reflected. But what happened in Nigeria? You had even probably the largest mall there, supermarket there, or they moved out of the country. ShopRite left Nigeria in 2022, late 2022, 2023. So you can just
all right. Quickly, as we wrap up now, we've done a comparison between the response between developed countries and developing countries in the time of supply disruption. Now, there's been reference to textbook approach to curb inflation, which both of you have alluded to. So if we're moving away from textbook approach to solving or tackling inflation, what should it be then? Quickly, Osaze, let's get your response.
It should be fiscal. It should be physical. We should leave monetary. The monetary has done the best it could. We should now go to the fiscal authority. And it has been mentioned so many times. The problem of Nigerian inflation is supply chain issues, structural issues. It has nothing to do with monetary issue, because, as I said, our informal sector is larger. So government, it's just government, fiscal policy. What's been driving high cost of food? It's been the farmers' headache crisis. Most farmers have left their farms. It's, you know, this thing is a mental thing. It's not a startup. It's not like your car that you just start up. People have lost their loved ones to kidnappers. People have paid their entire savings. I had a church member who the wife was just kidnapped day before yesterday. They had to pay 50 million. People have paid their entire savings out to kidnappers. So it's not something that they just start up and say, get to the farm. No, most people have abandoned it. Most people have sworn that they will never go to farms again. So it's a structural issue. That was the beginning of the food crisis. Then for the core inflation, it's been energy, power. There's no power, there's no light. I've been here for about 9 months. I've not seen the light blink for 1 second. But there's no light. Then you now increase electricity. Then you now remove subsidies. Then how do you want producers to produce? How do you want them to be competitive? In China, they are producing on public power, almost free. They are getting interest rate at 1%, 2% in China. But our producers are borrowing at 30, 35% in Nigeria, and they are having to pay high for electricity that they can't get. Diesel, which is the alternative, is not there. So it's simple. Fiscal authority, these are all fiscal issues. They are not monetary. So structural power.
All right, so
Summer-header
Segun
crisis,
Sopitan, if
cost
the
and so on.
CBN is going to have its next monetary policy committee meeting, we don't know when that will be. They've had 4 so far in this year. The next might be in the coming year. What would be your recommendations to them regarding MPR?
You know, the next meeting. Oh,
Okay, hold on, please. This question is for Segun Sopitan.
okay. So I think that first of all, the next meeting is going to happen next month, 22nd and 23rd, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that clearly, just like Osaze was saying, it's clear that rate hikes are not working. And like we have all said, look, all economic analysts continue to say this. Anytime that you talk about the MPC, it's a trade-off between curtailing inflation by hiking rates and curtailing or trying to encourage growth by reducing rates. You have to, so it's always a balancing act. We have been hiking rates now for almost 2 years straight, and inflation has been going up. So we have to stop that. I'm not hopeful. I don't think that they're going to reduce rates. I think they probably will hike it again because inflation has started an upward trend again. They'll probably hike it maybe by 50 basis points or maybe 25 basis points, But if you ask me, and I think that my co-analyst would agree because he was saying so, we should actually begin to see a reduction so that we can also drive growth, so that we can encourage people that need consumer credit, people that need loans from banks to drive businesses and get the money at affordable rates. What is driving our inflation is not just the liquidity problem. It's not just too much money chasing too few goods. It's the structural issues as well. So the CBN needs to sit back. In fact, I think that the CBN, if you ask what I would advise them to do, is to specifically target exchange rates, is to find a way to vigorously support the Naira, is to defend the Naira and push it down. We're trending at the official market, for goodness sake, at almost 1,700 Naira to the dollar. That's crazy. We need to get that back under control. And the CBN can do that with targeted inflation. We've been reporting increase in reserves. We're almost at $40 billion reserves now, which is fantastic. But what are we doing with it when the economy is pretty much going into a tailspin? We need to take some of that money and defend the Naira, get our rates back down to within reasonable limits, because that will have an immediate impact on inflation. It will bring inflation down because we import a lot of things.
We're out of time on the show today. Thank you so much, Segun Sopitan, who is Principal Partner, Woodbridge and Scott Consulting, and also Dr. Osaze Iyoha, who joined us all the way from Canada. He's an economic analyst. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah.
You can catch the show from beginning if you missed any part of it when you visit our YouTube channel at SOUQ News TV. And you can follow us on social media platforms. The handle is at SOUQ News TV. Leave a comment, like the page, of course, and you're free to share. I am Blessing Eichie. The show returns tomorrow, 8 a.m. West African time, and Market Insight comes up at 11 a.m. here on SOUQ News TV. To enjoy your day.
All right, this is where we call it a wrap, but don't forget the conversation continues on all our social media platforms. And don't forget, next thing we always return bigger and better. I am Femi Ayodele. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.